The glass door of the roadside diner exploded inward, sending shards flying across the checkered floor. Harlan Voss burst through with a sawed-off shotgun raised high, his eyes wild and desperate. He vaulted the counter and grabbed the waitress by the hair, jamming the barrel hard against her temple. "Where is the safe?" he snarled. "Please do not hurt me. I have two kids at home," the waitress cried out. In the private banquet room at the back of the building, 15 fully patched Hells Angels, who had been eating in silence after a long memorial run, suddenly stopped moving. Vance Beaumont, the massive chapter president, tilted his head, listening to the chaos on the other side of the thick doors. The men around him set down their forks and knives without a word. Their eyes met across the table, and in that instant they all understood the same thing. Someone had just made a very serious mistake. The Mojave Desert lay black and unforgiving under a moonless sky. Route 66 cut through the sand like a forgotten scar. Wind howled low across the cracked asphalt. 30 miles outside Barstow, the night felt endless. Inside a rusted 2004 Chevrolet Malibu, the heater had long since died. Harlan Voss gripped the steering wheel with knuckles gone white. His faded denim jacket clung damp to his back. Sweat mixed with the sour smell of old meth and fear. At 28, Brent Carver sat rigid in the passenger seat. 4 years younger than Harlan, he looked even smaller tonight. His eyes kept darting to the heavy Colt in his lap. The blued steel felt cold against his trembling fingers. "Stop messing with the damn gun!" Brent Harlan snapped. His voice came out raspy and tight. "You are going to shoot your own kneecap off before we even get inside." Brent swallowed hard. The taste of copper filled his mouth. "I do not like this, Harlan. We should have hit a gas station. Something closer to the city. Out here in the middle of nowhere, if something goes wrong, the cops will never find us." Harlan slammed his palm against the steering wheel. The sudden crack made Brent flinch. "You think Jimmy Rossi cares where they find our bodies? We owe him 15 grand by sunrise. 15 grand, Brent. You think knocking over a convenience store is going to cover that? We need a cash business. Something with a safe that has not seen an armored truck since Friday." Harlan pointed through the dusty windshield. Looming ahead like a lonely beacon in the black sea of sand, a flickering neon sign read, "Rosie's Copper Kettle. Open 24/7. That is the spot. Truckers roll through here all weekend. They tip heavy. The owner is an old-timer. Keeps the weekend deposits in a floor safe in the manager's office." Harlan had heard it from a guy who used to do their plumbing. Easy pickings. One waitress, maybe a fry cook, and a couple of sleepy old men. What Harlan did not know, what his inside source had failed to mention, was the layout of the Copper Kettle. Built in the late 1960s, the diner had a long, sound-dampening hallway that led to a private back banquet room. Heavy oak double doors sealed it off from the main floor. The building sat on a wide fenced lot. If Harlan had driven around back, instead of idling in the front gravel, he would have seen them. 15 heavily modified Harley-Davidson motorcycles lined up in a tight row, their chrome pipes still ticking and cooling in the desert air. They belonged to the Nomads chapter of the Hells Angels. Inside that back room, the air hung thick with cigar smoke and the rich smell of charred ribeye. Low voices rumbled like distant thunder. The chapter had just finished a 3-day memorial run through the Nevada desert. They had come to honor a fallen brother. Rosie's Copper Kettle was their safe place. Everett Whitaker, the retired mechanic who owned the diner, was uncle to their sergeant-at-arms. When the Angels rode in, Everett locked the back room, pulled the heavy blackout curtains, and let the men eat in privacy. At the head of the long tables pushed together sat Vance Beaumont. 68 years old, he stood 6'4" and weighed 280 pounds. His face was a map of deep scars and weathered skin. A thick, silver-streaked beard fell across the front of his worn denim cut. On his back, the Death's Head logo of the Hells Angels sat proud beside the President rocker. Vance had served in the Gulf War. He had come home carrying the same quiet discipline that kept him alive in the desert sands of Iraq. Now that discipline lived on the highway. To his right sat Brock Maddox. The sergeant-at-arms worked a heavy fixed blade knife under his fingernails, half listening to a younger prospect talk about a broken primary belt near Death Valley. "Let the kids speak," Brock Vance said. His voice rolled low like stones grinding in a cement mixer. He took a slow sip of black coffee. His sharp eyes moved across his brother's. Even here among family, his awareness never turned off. It was the same trait that had kept him breathing through 3 decades in the outlaw world. Out in the front of the diner, Marlene Hayes stifled a yawn. 42 years old, she worked double shifts to keep the lights on in her small Barstow apartment. She wiped the Formica counter with a damp rag. The jukebox in the corner played a soft Willie Nelson ballad. The only other customer was Earl, a 70-year-old long-haul trucker, fast asleep in a corner booth. His face rested on his folded jacket. Outside, the crunch of gravel announced the Malibu. Harlan killed the headlights. He parked across 2 handicap spaces right by the front door. Masks on, he ordered. He grabbed the sawed-off Mossberg 500. The barrel had been filed down, making it inaccurate, but deadly up close. Brent fumbled with his own mask. His breathing came ragged and fast. Harlan, please, let us just drive away. Get out of the car, Brent, Harlan hissed. He chambered a 12-gauge slug with a loud metallic clack. We do not get the money, Rossi kills us. We go in. We scream loud. We put the fear of God in whoever is behind that counter. We take the cash, and we are gone in 3 minutes. You watch the door. I get the money. Move. Brent swallowed the copper taste again. He shoved his door open and stepped into the freezing desert air. The neon glow of the copper kettle cast long shadows across the gravel. The stage was set. Harlan did not try the handle. He took 3 running steps and drove his boot into the center of the glass door. The pane exploded inward. Shards rained across the checkered linoleum. The metal frame buckled. Harlan burst through like a rabid animal. Shotgun raised high. Everybody on the ground face down. Do it now! His voice cracked with hysterical rage. Brent stumbled in a second later. He swept the Colt across the empty dining room. His eyes found Earl, who jolted awake. The old man's ceramic coffee mug hit the floor and shattered. Behind the counter, Marlene let out a sharp cry. She dropped the glass coffee pot she had been holding. Scalding liquid splashed across her sneakers. She dropped to her knees, hands behind her head. Tears welled fast. Please, she sobbed. Please do not hurt me. I have kids. Please, shut up, Harlan roared. He vaulted the counter and landed heavy beside her. Arr. He pressed the cold, jagged barrel of the shotgun against her temple. Where is the manager? Where is the floor safe? You have 10 seconds to tell me, or I blow your brains across the pie display. It is in the back office, Marlene cried. Everett is in the kitchen. He has the keys. Please. Harlan dragged her up by the hair. You are taking me to the kitchen. Move. Brent stood over Earl. Keep your gun on the old guy, he yelled. If he twitches, drop him. Harlan, please hurry, Brent called from the dining room. His voice shook. I think I hear sirens. He was lying. He just wanted to run. Deep in the back room, the sound of shattering glass echoed like a bomb. Vance had just lifted a forkful of steak. He froze mid-chew. Every man at the long tables froze with him. Laughter died. Bottles stopped clinking. Chairs stopped scraping. The silence that fell was heavier than any shout from the front. Brock Vance whispered, his voice low and dangerous. I heard it, boss. Vance held up one massive, scarred hand. The rest of the men stayed seated. He tilted his head, listening. Through the dampening walls came the muffled, frantic screams of Harlan Voss. Where is the safe? Open the damn register. Vance's jaw tightened. This was not a drunken fight. This was armed robbery. And the men out there were threatening Marlene, a woman who had served them coffee with a tired smile for years. They were also threatening a business owned by family of a Hell's Angel. In the rigid code of the club, disrespecting a brother's territory meant immediate severe consequences. Vance stood. He moved with deliberate calm. The terrifying grace of a man who had faced worse. He looked around the table at his brothers. These were men who had survived prison riots, territorial wars, and brutal interstate conflicts. Their eyes showed no fear. Only a cold, simmering rage. Dax Luther Jackson. Vance said, pointing to 3 of his largest enforcers, take the side hallway. Cut off the front exit. Nobody leaves. The 3 men nodded. They slipped brass knuckles over thick fingers and unholstered heavy leather saps. They moved out the back exit of the banquet room into the narrow service corridor that bypassed the kitchen. Brock Vance turned to his sergeant-at-arms. You and me through the kitchen. Let us go meet our new friends. In the front, Harlan shoved Marlene down the hallway toward the swinging doors. He kept the shotgun hard against her spine. "Where is the office?" he screamed. Down that hall, she choked, pointing. Harlan kicked the doors open. He expected to find a frightened manager cowering with a ring of keys. Instead, the doors swung wide to reveal Vance Beaumont standing dead center in the narrow corridor, arms crossed over his massive chest. Behind him, Brock Maddox twirled the tactical knife with terrifying ease. Harlan froze. His meth-addled brain short-circuited. He stared up at the towering man. His eyes dropped to the president patch over Vance's heart. "You look lost, son," Vance rumbled. His voice echoed low and steady in the confined space. Harlan panicked. He began to raise the shotgun toward Vance's chest. "Back up! Back the hell up! I will blow you in half!" Vance did not flinch. He did not blink. He simply stared down the barrel with absolute calm. "You pull that trigger," he said softly, taking one slow, heavy step forward. "And I promise you, boy, the police will be the absolute least of your problems." Time stretched thin in the grease-stained hallway. Harlan stood frozen. The shotgun trembled in his sweaty hands. The adrenaline that had carried him through the front door was draining fast. Standing before him was not a terrified civilian. This was a combat veteran and outlaw who had ridden beside legends. Vance Beaumont carried an aura of immovable authority that could not be faked. "I said back up," Harlan shrieked. His voice cracked high and thin. He dug his boots into the linoleum, trying to brace himself. His finger twitched against the trigger guard. Vance took another deliberate step forward. He invaded Harlan's space completely. His sheer size blocked the fluorescent lights. "You are making a profound mistake," son, Vance said. His voice dropped an octave. "You walked into the wrong house tonight." Harlan's mind snapped. He decided to fire. Not to kill. Just to blow a hole in the ceiling. Create noise and chaos. Let him escape. He tightened his grip and began to squeeze. He never saw Brock move. The sergeant-at-arms had read the flinch before Harlan even formed the thought. With blinding speed that belied his hulking frame, Brock lunged. His left hand shot out like a striking viper. He clamped down on the scorching barrel and wrenched it sharply upward. The weapon discharged with a deafening roar. 12-gauge buckshot obliterated the acoustic ceiling tiles above them. Plaster fiberglass and sparks rained down in a thick, choking cloud. The concussive blast blew out a fluorescent bulb. Half the kitchen plunged into flickering, dusty darkness. Before Harlan's ears could register, the ringing Brock's right hand drove the weighted pommel of the tactical knife squarely into the center of Harlan's forehead. The impact sounded like a bat striking a melon. Harlan's eyes rolled back. His legs turned to liquid. He collapsed onto the hard linoleum like a sack of wet cement. Unconscious before his shoulders hit the ground, Brock smoothly racked the shotgun, ejecting the spent shell. He handed the weapon to Vance, who looked down at the bleeding thief with cold disgust. Out in the main dining room, the shotgun blast echoed like artillery. Brent jumped nearly a foot. The sound shattered what little courage he had left. He knew instantly that Harlan was either dead or captured. He was alone. Dax, the towering enforcer with arms like tree trunks, did not flinch. He took one heavy step forward, brass knuckles hanging loose at his side. Luther and Jackson mirrored him. They stepped over the shattered glass. They fanned out, boxing Brent into the center aisle. "Please," Brent whimpered. Tears streamed down his pale cheeks. His knees knocked so hard he could barely stand. "Please, man, I am just the driver. I did not want to do this. We owe money. I swear to God, I do not want to shoot anybody." "Then put the iron down, kid," Dax said. His voice was quiet, almost soothing, but carried lethal promise. "You have exactly 3 seconds to drop that piece, or I am going to take it from you and feed it to you." 1. Brent did not wait for 2. He threw the Colt onto the floor. It skittered across the tiles and bumped against the booth base. As soon as the weapon left his hands, he dropped to his knees, fingers laced behind his head. He sobbed uncontrollably. Luther stepped forward. His heavy boots crunched glass. He kicked the handgun far under a table. Jackson reached down, grabbed Brent by the scruff of his jacket, and hauled him to his feet. He slammed him face first against the nearest wall. He patted him down with rough professional efficiency. "He is clean," Jackson grunted, keeping a forearm pressed against the back of Brent's neck. From the kitchen, the swinging doors kicked open. Brock emerged, dragging the unconscious, bleeding body of Harlan by the collar. Harlan's heels left a faint trail of dust and plaster. Brock tossed him onto the floor beside Brent's feet. Vance walked out behind them, carrying the confiscated shotgun over one shoulder. He surveyed the scene. Broken glass, sobbing getaway driver, terrified waitstaff. Marlene, still kneeling behind the counter, peeked over the register. When she saw Vance standing there safe and in control, she let out a long, shuddering breath. "You all right, Marlene?" Vance asked. His harsh tone softened into genuine concern. "I think so, Grizz," she stammered, wiping her eyes. He put the gun to her head. Vance's jaw tightened. He looked down at the unconscious Harlan. For a long moment, the room grew cold. "Is that so?" he murmured. Everett Whitaker finally stepped from the back office. He clutched an old rusted revolver. Seeing the situation neutralized, he lowered the weapon. His face was pale but furious. "Grizz, what the hell happened out here?" "Pest control," Everett Vance replied calmly. "Got a couple of strays looking for an easy meal. Turns out they bit off more than they could chew." Harlan groaned. Consciousness returned in waves of blinding pain. He blinked. His vision swam. As the room came into focus, the horror settled in. He sat on the floor, leaning against the counter. Surrounding him in a tight semicircle stood 15 fully patched Hell's Angels. They were not yelling. They were not throwing punches. They simply stared in absolute silence. Beside him, Brent hyperventilated, his head buried in his hands. "Well, well," Vance said. He pulled a chair from a nearby table and sat backward on it. His massive arms rested over the backrest. He leaned in close to Harlan, close enough that Harlan could smell stale coffee and tobacco on his breath. "Sleeping Beauty joins us. Look, man." Harlan choked, spitting blood onto the floor. "We did not know you guys were back there. We were just after the safe. We owe a guy in the city, Jimmy Rossi. He is going to kill us if we do not pay." "We were desperate." "Desperate," Vance repeated, tasting the word. He shook his head slowly. "You think you are the only desperate people in the world. You think your debts give you the right to walk into a man's livelihood, terrorize a hardworking mother, and threaten to blow her brains out over a cash register." Harlan swallowed hard. He could not meet the giant biker's eyes. "You boys have a very skewed perception of consequence," Vance continued, his tone conversational but dangerous. "You were afraid of this Jimmy Rossi. So afraid, you thought it was brilliant to rob a highway diner at 3 in the morning. But you failed to calculate a crucial variable." Vance leaned closer. His voice dropped to a whisper that carried like thunder. "You failed to calculate us." Harlan shuddered. He suddenly understood that Jimmy Rossi and his city enforcers were nothing compared to the men in this room. Rossi was a businessman who dealt in fear. These men were a brotherhood built on unyielding loyalty and brutal retribution. Harlan knew with absolute certainty that if Vance gave the order, he and Brent would simply cease to exist. Their bodies would vanish into the Mojave, where even the coyotes would never find them. "Please," Harlan begged. His tough facade shattered completely. Tears mixed with blood on his face. "Please do not kill us. Just let us go. We will leave the state. We will never come back. Please." Vance stared at him for a long, agonizing minute. The silence pressed down on the room like a physical weight. Finally, he stood. "Brock," he called without turning. "Yeah, boss," Brock responded, stepping forward. "Get some heavy-duty zip ties from the saddlebags. Bind their wrists and ankles tight." Vance turned to Everett. "Everett, dial the sheriff's department. Tell them you had a break-in and the perpetrators have been safely subdued by concerned citizens." Everett nodded. A grim smile touched his lips. He reached for the landline. Harlan and Brent let out simultaneous gasps of relief. They were going to jail. But they were going to live. Prison suddenly sounded like a luxury compared to whatever these men could have done. As Brock and Dax roughly bound the thieves and hauled them into a corner booth to wait for the police, Vance walked over to Marlene. He reached into his leather cut and pulled out a thick folded wad of $100 bills. Club funds meant for the memorial run. He pressed the money gently into her trembling hands. "For the broken coffee pot," he said with a soft, reassuring wink. "And for dealing with the mess." "Vance, I cannot take this," Marlene protested, though her hands closed around the cash. "It was easily 2 months' rent." "Consider it hazard pay," Vance insisted. He turned back to his brothers. His commanding presence snapped the room to attention. All right, boys, show's over. Let us get these tables cleaned up and finish our steaks before they get cold. We hit the highway at dawn. Harlan risked another glance upward. The semicircle had loosened slightly, but the men still formed a wall between him and any exit. Their leather cuts carried the smell of road and oil and old smoke. Their hands were large and scarred from years of work most men would never understand. These were not the kind of men who made empty threats. They had already proven that. Harlan felt the last of his defiance drain away. He had come here desperate and high and stupid. He had found something older and harder than anything Rossi could throw at him. The realization tasted like ash. Beside him, Brent kept whispering pleas under his breath, like a prayer that had already been answered and refused at the same time. Brock returned with a handful of heavy zip ties. He moved with the same economy he had shown when he took Harlan down. No wasted motion, no show. He bound Harlan's wrists first. The plastic bit into skin already raw from the struggle. Then the ankles. Harlan did not resist. There was no point. Brent held still while his own bindings were applied. His tears had stopped, but his shoulders shook with silent tremors. When both men were secured, Dax and Luther hauled them up and deposited them none too gently into the corner booth nearest the shattered door. Harlan's head throbbed with every movement. He leaned against the vinyl seat. The cool surface felt almost soothing against his bruised skull. Vance pulled another chair and sat so he could watch both of them. He did not gloat. He did not raise his voice. He simply waited. The rest of the chapter began to move again. Quiet, efficient. They righted overturned chairs. Someone swept broken glass into a neat pile. The smell of reheated steak drifted from the kitchen. Everett disappeared for a moment and returned with a fresh pot of coffee. He poured without asking. The ordinary sound of liquid hitting ceramic felt strangely loud in the charged air. Marlene moved behind the counter again. She wiped her hands on a clean towel. Her eyes kept drifting to the corner booth and then away. The money Vance had given her stayed folded in her apron pocket. Harlan stared at the floor between his boots. The zip ties were tight enough to remind him with every breath that he was not going anywhere. He thought about Rossi, about the deadline, about the desert outside that could swallow bodies without a trace. None of it felt real anymore. The only real thing in the room was the quiet presence of the men who had taken everything from him in less than 10 minutes. No sirens, no negotiations, just decisive action, and now this patient waiting. He understood at last that he had stepped into a world that operated by rules he had never learned. Rules older than any cartel ledger. Rules that did not bend for desperation or excuses. Brent shifted in the booth. His voice came hoarse. "What are you going to do with us?" Vance did not answer right away. He took a slow sip of the coffee Everett had poured. When he spoke, his words were measured. "We are going to let the law do what the law does. You will answer for what you did here tonight. Armed robbery, assault, destruction of property. That is between you and the state of California. What happens after that is between you and whatever God you believe in." Brent swallowed. His Adam's apple bobbed. And Rossi. Vance's eyes stayed flat. Rossi will hear what happened, one way or another. Men like him do not like loose ends, but that is not our concern tonight. Our concern was this diner, this woman, this place that belongs to family. That concern is settled. Harlan closed his eyes. The weight of those words settled deeper than any threat Rossi had ever made. He had come here to steal money. He had found something that could not be stolen or bought or threatened into silence. The brotherhood in this room had already decided his fate, not with violence, with something colder and more permanent. The certainty that he had crossed a line no amount of begging could uncross. The distant wail of sirens rose on the desert wind. Red and blue lights began to strobe against the broken glass of the front door. Vance stood. He looked once more at the two men in the booth. His expression gave nothing away. "Remember this moment," he said quietly. "Not because we hurt you, because we did not. That is the difference between men who have a code and men who only have debts." The sirens grew louder. Tires crunched on gravel outside. Vance turned and walked toward the back room where the rest of his brothers waited. The chapter moved with him. A single body, leather and steel and quiet purpose. They left the two bound thieves in the booth under the flickering lights. The smell of plaster dust and coffee and old leather lingered long after the men had gone. Harlan sat very still. For the first time in years, the shaking in his hands had nothing to do with meth or fear of Rossi. It had everything to do with the understanding that some debts could never be paid with money. Some lines once crossed stayed crossed forever. The sirens grew louder until red and blue lights strobed across the broken glass of the front door. Two sheriff's cruisers pulled into the gravel lot. Deputies stepped out with weapons drawn. Flashlights cut through the darkness. They moved toward the shattered entrance with the caution of men who had answered too many midnight calls on this stretch of Route 66. The lead deputy pushed through the ruined door. His beams swept the dining room and stopped. What he saw made him lower his gun a fraction. 15 large men in leather cuts sat in the back booth eating cherry pie and drinking coffee. They looked up calmly. No one reached for a weapon. No one stood. The only sign of trouble was the two zip-tied men slumped in the corner booth near the front and the glittering shards of glass across the floor. The second deputy followed. His eyes widened at the scene. One of the bound men began to cry with relief. Harlan Voss kept his head down. Brent Carver lifted his face. "Please," he sobbed. "Please take us. We will go. Just get us out of here." The deputies moved in. They checked the zip ties. They read the two men their rights. Harlan did not resist. He let them pull him to his feet. His legs felt unsteady, but he stayed silent. Brent kept thanking them between sobs. The deputies guided both men toward the cruisers. As they passed the back booth, one of the Hells Angels raised a coffee mug in a small salute. The gesture held no mockery, only quiet acknowledgement that the night had ended the way it needed to end. Marlene Hayes stood behind the counter. She still wore her apron. The folded bills from Vance sat heavy in her pocket. She watched the deputies load the two thieves into the back seats. Her hands had stopped shaking. Everett Whitaker came to stand beside her. He placed the old revolver on the counter. It looked small and useless now. The deputies returned. They took statements. Marlene told them what had happened in a steady voice. Two men kicked in the door. One put a gun to her head. They demanded the safe. Then the men in the back room came out. They stopped it. That was all. The deputies wrote it down. They looked at the 15 bikers who continued to eat their pie as if midnight armed robberies were just another part of the desert night. One deputy shook his head. "You boys always seem to be in the right place at the right time." Vance Beaumont wiped his mouth with a paper napkin. He stood. "We were just finishing a memorial run. Stopped here like we always do. Glad we could help." The deputy nodded. He did not press further. He had seen enough to know the story would hold. The two robbers had already confessed in the cruiser. They wanted no part of staying near these men any longer than necessary. The deputies drove away. Their lights faded into the black. The desert swallowed the sound of the engines. Inside the copper kettle, the air felt lighter. The broken glass had been swept into a pile by the door. Someone had taped a piece of cardboard over the worst of the shattered pane. The jukebox still played soft and low. Vance walked over to Marlene. He reached into his cut again and added another fold of bills to the first. She tried to refuse. He shook his head. "For the kids, school clothes, groceries, whatever they need this month. You do not argue with an old man on this." Marlene looked at the money. Her eyes filled, but she did not let the tears fall. She nodded once. "Thank you. For my children. For me." Vance gave her the same small nod he had given earlier, the one that carried years inside it. "You are family here. That does not change because some fool with a shotgun forgot who he was dealing with." Everett Whitaker motioned Vance toward the back hallway. The two men stepped away from the others. The chapter stayed in the booth finishing their meal. Brock Maddox kept an eye on the front door out of habit. Everett spoke quietly. His voice was rough from years of kitchen smoke and desert wind. "Grizz, there is something you need to know about Marlene." Vance waited. He had learned long ago that silence brought out the truth faster than questions. Everett continued. "Her husband was a Marine, Gulf War, same time you were over there. Name was Daniel Hayes. He pulled 3 of your boys out of a burning transport outside Basra when the rest of the column had already written them off. One of them was a prospect who rode with us later. The kid never forgot. He told me the story the night before he patched in. Said the man who saved him had a wife and two little ones back home. Said if anything ever happened to him, someone should look after them. Everett paused. He looked toward the counter where Marlene was pouring fresh coffee for the remaining customers who had wandered in after the sirens faded. Daniel Hayes died in a training accident 2 years after he came home. Marlene raised those kids alone on what the VA gave her and what she could earn here. She never asked for help, never told anyone who her husband was. But that prospect remembered, and now so do I. Vance stood very still. The hallway lights cast long shadows across his scarred face. He thought of the burning transport, the heat, the screams, the young Marine who had run back into the flames when everyone else had pulled back. He had never known the man's name, only that he had bought 3 lives with his own courage. Now the pieces locked into place. The reason the protection of this diner had felt like more than duty. The reason he had moved without hesitation when he heard the shotgun blast. The ledger had been open all along. He had simply not seen the writing until Everett spoke. Vance placed a heavy hand on Everett's shoulder. "You did right telling me." Everett nodded. He did not need more words. The two men stood in silence for a moment. The low rumble of conversation from the booth drifted down the hallway. Leather creaked, coffee cups clinked, the ordinary sounds of men who had faced worse and kept moving. Vance returned to the booth. He sat. The chapter looked at him. No one asked. They knew when their president needed space. He finished his coffee. The pie had gone cold, but he ate it anyway. The sweetness cut through the dust and cordite still lingering in his throat. When the plates were clear, he stood again. "Right, we have taken enough of Everett's hospitality for one night. Time to get back on the road." The men rose without complaint. They left money on the table. More than the bill, enough to cover repairs and then some. They filed past Marlene. Each one gave her a small nod or a quiet word. She answered every one. Her back was straighter than it had been at the start of the shift. The fear had been replaced by something steadier. Gratitude mixed with the knowledge that she was not alone in this desert. Outside, the desert wind had eased. The motorcycles waited in their neat row. Chrome caught the first hint of dawn light on the eastern horizon. Vance walked to his bike. He swung a leg over the seat. The machine felt solid beneath him, the same way it always had after a long run. He looked back at the diner, the cardboard over the broken door, the neon signs still flickering. Marlene stood in the doorway. She raised one hand. Vance lifted 2 fingers from the handlebar in return. Then he thumbed the starter. The big V-twin caught and settled into its familiar idle. One by one, the other engines came to life. The sound rolled across the empty lot like distant thunder. 15 machines, 15 men, a single formation. They pulled out onto Route 66 in tight order. Headlights cut through the gray light before sunrise. The road stretched ahead, empty and straight. Vance rode point. Brock rode beside him. The rest followed in disciplined pairs. The wind picked up again. It carried the smell of sage and cooling sand. Behind them, the copper kettle grew smaller until the neon sign was just a faint glow against the black. The legend had already begun. Truckers would tell it first, then the locals. How 15 Hells Angels had been eating in the back room when 2 fools tried to rob the place. How they moved like they had been waiting for that exact moment. How they left the thieves zip-tied and grateful to see the sheriff. How they paid for the damage and rode away before the sun came up. The story would grow with each telling, but the core would stay the same. A code had been honored. A debt had been paid without anyone asking for payment. A woman who had raised her children alone would sleep safer tonight because men she barely knew had decided she was worth protecting. Vance felt the weight of the road beneath his wheels, the same weight he had felt for 30 years. It was not heavier tonight. If anything, it felt lighter. The ledger that had opened in that burning transport outside Basra had finally balanced. He had not known the name of the man who saved his brothers. Now he knew the name of the man's wife, and he knew that protecting her had not been chance. It had been the quiet arithmetic of honor that never let a debt go unpaid. The desert opened around them. The sun broke the horizon in a thin red line. The motorcycles roared on, 15 men riding into a new day with the same certainty they had carried through the night. The road belonged to them, and so did the promise they kept without ever needing to speak it aloud. Marlene watched the taillights disappear. She locked the front door as best she could with the broken frame. She turned off the neon. The diner fell quiet except for the hum of the cooler and the soft tick of cooling coffee pots. She pulled the folded bills from her apron. She counted them in the dim light from the kitchen. Enough for groceries, enough for the electric bill, enough to buy her daughter new shoes before school started. She folded the money again and placed it in the register drawer where the safe key used to live. Then she walked to the back booth. The table had been wiped clean. The chairs were pushed in. She ran her hand across the wood. It felt warm from the bodies that had sat there. She thought of Daniel, of the stories he had never told her about the war, of the men he had saved who had never known her name until tonight. She whispered a thank you into the empty room. The words did not need to be loud. The night had already heard them. Everett Whitaker turned off the last of the lights. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked out at the parking lot. The gravel still showed the tracks of 15 motorcycles. He smiled the small smile of a man who had seen too much and still believed some things worked out the way they were supposed to. He locked the back door. The copper kettle settled into its usual pre-dawn quiet. Outside, the desert waited, patient, endless, ready for whatever the next night would bring. But for now, the diner held its peace. The broken door would be fixed by morning. The story would spread. And somewhere on the long black ribbon of Route 6615, men rode toward the rising sun, their debt honored and their code intact. The kind of ending that did not need fireworks or speeches. Only the steady thrum of engines and the knowledge that some lines once drawn stayed drawn forever.